Following the Japanese military attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued 3 presidential proclamations requiring over 1 million Japanese, German, and Italian aliens residing in the United States to register as enemy aliens pursuant to the Enemy Aliens Act of 1798. These immigrants were subject to many restrictions of their civil rights, including carrying certificates of identification, individual and group exclusion from military zones, internee exchanges, deportation, repatriation, alien enemy registration, travel restrictions, and property confiscation. While very few know the full history, what most know is that in February 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which resulted in the exclusion and mass incarceration of 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast, most of whom were U.S. citizens or legal residents.
In April of 1942, my parents and older brother were forced from their Watsonville house and bused to an assembly center in Salinas, California. There they stayed in horse stables until the construction of the Poston internment camp in Arizona was completed. 3 months later, on July 4th, Independence Day, 1942, they were taken by train to their new residence in Poston Camp 2 in Arizona, where they were incarcerated for 2.5 years in well-documented, terrible living conditions.
Executive Order 9066 was also used to exclude hundreds of persons of German and Italian ancestry, including citizens, from the West Coast and other prohibited zones. The U.S. military enforced Executive Order 9066. The U.S. Justice and State Departments oversaw the enemy alien program. Additionally, from December 1941 to February 1948, the U.S. government orchestrated the deportation and internment of over 6,000 men, women, and children of Japanese, German, and Italian ancestry from 15 Latin American countries, many of whom were used as hostages in exchange for Americans held by Japan and Germany.
Since I didn't have too much breast milk, I got canned milk for the trip. As soon as we got on the boat, the guards spoke English, and I didn't understand what they were saying. They just threw the milk into the ocean, one by one. I said in castellano, "Por favor, no, esta leche es para la bebé." Even though I didn't speak English, I said, "Please, please, baby no miruku konna ni suru no ni. Don't do this to the baby's milk." He just threw away one after another. My baby cried. There was no milk. Everybody said, "Poor little thing, this little baby is going to die because there's no milk."
The Alien Enemies Act formed the legal basis for depriving German Americans of their civil liberties. Over 300,000 German immigrants were subject to enemy alien restrictions. By the end of the war, 11,000 persons of German ancestry, including many American-born children, were interned. Thousands were excluded from military zones. Furthermore, the U.S. rounded up at least 4,050 German Latin Americans from 15 Latin American countries for internment, many of whom were used for hostage exchange with Nazi Germany.
My father, Fred Berg, and my mom, Bertha Berg, were taken away on December 8, 1941. Several days later, my older sister, who had been in Molokai, drove into the yard. My little sister and I were elated to see her. We told her what had happened and that we thought Mom and Dad were dead, for they had disappeared. The next day, exactly the same thing happened. A black car drove into the yard. This time they asked for my sister. I lost it, screaming hysterically. "No, no, Ellie, they're going to kill you too," I screamed again. "Don't take our sister. Don't kill her like you killed Mommy and Daddy." I beat at the men ferociously with my fists as they led her across the lawn and into the car. They peeled my fingers off the window of the door, and they slowly drove off. A few hours later, Ellie called and asked if we were okay. I barely had time to reply when she had to hang up. I suddenly had hope. If she was still alive, then maybe, just maybe, Mom and Dad were also. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad were being held at Fort Armstrong Immigration Station. Very nervous young men holding loaded rifles tipped with bayonets had herded them into separate areas. It was an experience of worry, bewilderment, and horror. When Mom asked why she was being held, a guard shouted, "You are an alien Nazi!"
Like the Japanese and Germans, the freedom of more than 600,000 enemy alien Italians were also restricted during World War II. During the war, more than 10,000 Italians living on the West Coast were forced to leave their homes in prohibited zones. Dozens of naturalized citizens of Italian descent were excluded from military zones on both coasts. Over 3,000 Italians, including some 200 from Latin America, were arrested and detained, with hundreds formerly interned in camps run by the U.S. Army.
To be Italian or of Italian background at that time was to be in limbo. No one knew why those who were taken were interned, so everyone was afraid they would be next. Since some of the men taken were citizens, fear was everywhere. People I know now, who were teenagers then, will still not talk about their father's internment.
The whole thing really started to come down hard when my mother actually had a nervous breakdown over I think that's what they call it. She just had an absolute breakdown and ended up in a mental hospital in Livermore for 2 or 3 months.
I have found it very hard to believe that these men were taken and imprisoned without having a hearing, that their families were ignored. The American government did not acknowledge the suffering caused by the internment. I do not want my country responsible for this in the future.
The events in this country since 9/11 have resurrected the nightmares of the Enemy Alien Act, and we are repeating the mistakes of World War II. What were those mistakes? First, we relied on weak intelligence to help us separate the very few who were truly dangerous from the many who were innocent. Second, we assumed that aliens are the enemy. The very title of the Alien Enemy Act weds the two ideas. It led to a dragnet approach in which a net was thrown over entire communities in the hopes of catching a few spies or saboteurs. Finally, in dealing with our immigrant population, we trashed the very due process provisions of the Constitution that brought those immigrants here seeking freedom and opportunity.
I received the news of my father's arrest on July 27, 2004, when I was visiting relatives in Jordan for the summer. I was overwhelmed, terrified, and shocked with disbelief. How could this happen to my father? How could this happen in a country which has been his chosen homeland for 25 years? A country which prides itself for being one nation for one people under God, with liberty and justice for all? But where is the justice and liberty when 7 men with guns raid our home at 4:30 in the morning looking for my father? What do you tell a child when he wakes up in the middle of the night only to find an unfamiliar face staring back at him with a gun pointed upward? Till this day, my little brothers cannot go to sleep by themselves because of the trauma and psychological devastation that they have had to endure because of that night. What do you tell a child when he innocently looks up at you and asks, "Why is Daddy in jail?" Only bad people go to jail, and Daddy is not bad.